there's a different feeling when you master something, even at a low level of mastery with a real fundamental physical movement, or learning how to play a musical instrument, just getting that first little sequence down or hitting that just the right note at the right time. It feels good. We've taken so much mastery out of education and definitely taken it out of PE. It's just a lot of directing people to do this and that, but I keep asking, where's the teaching? Where are the methods?
Welcome to the Culture Club, conversations on gym culture and the future of physical fitness. I notice your CV goes on for pages, and it points to your kind of unique career as a historical kinesiologist. And I can't think that industry has a very significant lobby in Washington, D.C., or a very big annual meeting. But as a physical educator, it gives you a pretty unique vantage point to see, what's been done in the past, what's worked, what hasn't, and so forth. So, someone who looks at PE programs today will see kids playing a whole bunch of sports, and they might confuse that for physical culture. But I want to start with kind of the distinction between that sports culture and physical culture. And since this podcast is supposed to be about physical culture, I thought we could start off just with your definition of that term, physical culture.
Oh, great, Charlie. Well, thanks for having me on the show, and thanks to Michael Campy for being a great friend over the years, and all the intelligent conversations that we've had surrounding music and culture. So it's a pleasure to be here. I have to laugh a little bit, although maybe I should be crying because there are not many lobbyists in Washington, D.C. advocating for physical education today. Although I must say, I wouldn't be opposed to moving to DC and jumping into that fray, because right now, especially in May of 2020, we're once again looking at physical education going to the proverbial firing squad and being eliminated from the curriculum. And that's extremely concerning and frustrating. And it also makes me angry as an American citizen and a credentialed PE teacher.
Yeah, so why don't we just quickly kind of run through some of the highlights of your career as a physical educator. Last night I was watching the documentary that you were involved in the creation of, the Motivation Factor, which looks at the La Sierra, famous La Sierra PE program. Maybe not as famous as it should be, but it's one of the high points, I'd say, of physical culture, at least in the United States in the past 50, 60 years. You have worked in a lot of different contexts, but one of the main ones is teaching physical education. How did you get into that?
Well, it's a good question. And if I go back to your first inquiry about physical culture, yes, physical education should not be sport-based if you take a classical approach to that. Sports are part of physical education, or were part of physical education, and should be, but they shouldn't be the center of a PE program. And really, and we're both experienced with MoveNat and a classical approach to physical education. You have to teach people how to move properly, and from there, they then have the best chance to be the best athlete or the best person in general. Even if you're not an athlete, one should be physically active. I don't really care if my students play sports or not, as long as they grow up with a mindfulness about physical culture, and that it's extremely important to be exercising on a daily basis and going outside into the wilderness and identifying with nature and all these other things that go along with developing the whole person, physical culture, and just culture in general. And this goes back to ancient Greece. So that's kind of the first part of your inquiry. In terms of what PE is today, it's digressed into more of a sports or games type situation where many of the PE teachers don't know the basic methods of movement. We talked about walking before we did the show, just in doing our preliminary research and chit chat, and it's rare to find a teacher that would teach a student how to stand and walk and sit, let alone run, jump, and pull and push. So these are all these are all I'm laughing, but again, it's sad because these are fundamentals of physical education and being a physically literate person. I mean, the building blocks, the foundation of movement lies in those and a few other things. And no amount of just playing a game is really going to do a quality job teaching that.
Give us kind of an overview of the state of the physical union. In your writing and in your, it's almost a kind of activism. You're trying to bring back physical culture, starting with schools and PE programs, but the idea that having a more robust physical culture will create uh, greater resilience in the population, that it kind of dovetails with broader values, and that comes through in the documentary, the motivation factor as well. That you can't really separate being a good citizen from being physically fit in some ways, and it harkens back. I've been doing a lot of study into to JFK's challenge to the American public when he, even before he took office, kind of highlighting the fact that we've become soft Americans in many ways, and that we've lost the knowledge that every previous successful civilization had about the importance of physical vigor to the health of the country. So, what are you seeing kind of on the ground in terms of the average level of fitness of a student or someone? Let's just say a high school student, a middle school student. What's the state of the union?
It's not good. And that came out in our film. The Motivation Factor is a film by Doug Orchard Films. Doug Orchard, amazing filmmaker, but also one of my best friends, smart guy. Um, and I did the history research of the film. But in the film, and I hope people will watch it because the quickest way to get this information in the least amount of time is that 90-minute film. It's going to give you a good foundation of what classical PE was, what it can still be, and why it's important that we should start doing it, because we did stop doing it in most places. Although we pointed out in the film, without spoiling any surprises, that there are little pockets here and there that are still doing classical physical education. But it used to be called like a moral duty to be physically fit and be strong, and then this goes back to ancient Greece and other civilizations, and now it's just almost not on the radar of people at all. I can tell you a couple things about teaching physical education from a TK, was pre-kindergarten level, to sixth grade. That by second grade, probably 80+% of the students already exhibit signs of deformity, and these aren't deformities that they were born with. These are postural deformities from improper seating in schools, which is a whole other area of my research. When it comes to classical PE, you have to get into all kinds of different side routes, if you will, and ergonomics and furniture in schools is one of those areas I looked at pretty extensively. And so they're not sitting properly, they're not getting the right kind of exercise, whether it's PE or recess. And so these things creep into the body, and literally by second grade, I'm seeing some deformities and major dysfunctions in people. I've got third graders that moan and groan when they get off the ground. Now, I've worked with seniors, and I expect them sometimes, they were, 70, 80, or even 90 plus years old. It's kind of hard for them to get off the ground, but in third grade, are you kidding me? I mean, come on. When I was in third grade, the concept of back pain was like, it was not even on my radar screen. And yet I have third graders complaining that their backs hurt all the time. But when you look at how they're sitting and how they're living, it's not a surprise. Now, what we're talking about right now, Charlie, is completely off the radar with almost everyone in the country. But I hope the people that listen to this will start thinking, because when you go into second or third grade and you've already got deformities and you've already got back pain, don't expect to age well. We've already got joint replacements that are like so popular today. We've got addictions to pain medications with OxyContin and all kinds of other pharmaceuticals out there. It's not good. I mean, how many physical therapists are we going to train to deal with all these broken people? So much of this is preventable, and the research shows over 70% of our health problems are preventable and behavior based, so Um, that's what I'm seeing. Um, are there kids out there super athletic and fit? Yeah, we still have those kids, but they're not they're not representing the general bell curve. They're the outliers in my opinion. And interestingly, I mean, some of my kids that were the most quote unquote athletic, playing year round sports, when I put them on a straight pull up bar, they couldn't do one single pull up. So
Compare
even
that.
though they're not overweight and they're athletic and they're in sports all the time, they couldn't do one pull up. They didn't know how to do a hip hinge. Now, I've been told by one of my friends that was a NFL strength coach for a Super Bowl team that the hip hinge is the most important thing I can teach my PE students because everything starts or stops from a hip hinge. And yet, this kid, the one I'm thinking about off the top of my head, year round sports, he goes, "Oh, we do that in baseball." I go, "Well, show me." And he went down and rounded his back completely kyphotic. So it's like the physical literacy, meaning the ability for our children to read movement at the ABC level is not there today. Yet in Russia, I can show you an example of a Russian school where they talk about the ABCs of movement in their PE program. So it's not that other people aren't doing it, but we're not doing it here. And so that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, you can compare that inability to do one push-up with a moment in the film where there's a student talking about being able to do 37 pull-ups, and that wasn't even probably the top kid in his class. That you look at just the average rate that they achieved, and we won't have time to get into the full uh, details of the strategy that they use and the shorts color system for encouraging a little bit of healthy competition and some cooperation with that. But to come back to this idea of the sitting and the deformities, it really is a tragedy, and it's totally preventable. It's one of the risk factors like smoking or alcohol use that can easily be controlled for. You know, they say smoking or sitting is the new smoking. Uh, and what do we know about the ways to recover from that? And it's basically doing movement. It's making it more frequent and posture. You know, the old adage of stand up straight with your shoulders back is kind of worthless if it's not coupled with some sort of active movement to compensate for that. I've been preparing for this 50-mile march, which was the again kind of the brainchild of Kennedy, JFK, but Roosevelt before him. In my research on walking and efficient walking technique, I found that walking is prescribed as a remedy for back pain. That if you're walking with good form, it will carry over into the kinds of healthy postures that you need to avoid back pain later in life. Uh, you have some videos that teach walking technique. Is that something that you start off a PE program with, just the basic walking?
Yeah, it's part of my PE teaching, but when I first started teaching K6 PE, and I looked out, and in my classes range from I had over 50 kindergartners at one time, and up to 120 elementary kids at one time. That's a huge amount of children. And I'm looking at, even with everything I know, it was daunting. I'm looking out the first week. I'm like, okay, what what am I going to do? You know, I've got thousands of pages of reading in my head, and probably the best classical PE library in the West Coast. And I went back to the basics, which if you go back to ancient Greece, it was balance and rhythm. That was their focus areas, balance and rhythm. And so I started by teaching them how to root through their feet and know where their feet were and how their feet work and how to stand up well. In other words, being mindful of gravity, how to experiment with gravitational force. And there's a certain way I do it, although this centering technique, there I can show you a book from the 1920s. It was very, very similar to how I do it. And I actually saw the reference after I started doing it the way I do it. So it's a way to get centered on your feet, get your postural line set, take a few breaths, mindful of that. And so back to your walking question, do I teach walking? Yes. First, you have to teach a person how to stand. And that's pretty important. And then from there, it's the gliding gait And there have been a lot of people over the years and generations that have taught that in different ways. But the video that I put out last week or a couple weeks ago was just, it's a simplified way of condensing everything that I've learned in the last couple of decades on gait. And it's funny, gait, I did corporate health for a long time at a pretty high level, and I got made fun of in corporate meetings over gait because even people in the medical side laughed at me because they thought it was ridiculous that I was raising a hand in the back of the room out of concern for walking contests, because people were coming to me in the corporate gym with their knees blowing up
Mm.
because they didn't walk well. So they're actually getting hurt by trying to get their 10,000 steps a day, or whatever it was they were reaching for. And so even at the corporate level, what I was teaching was PE 101, because most of these people had never learned how to move properly when they were in grade school. And then they went into adulthood and a career of sitting predominantly. And then you start trying to exercise on all those movement dysfunctions, and good things don't happen typically. There's going to be pain and discomfort, if not a joint failure, which we see today, even with children. There are joint failures from overuse injuries. It's just crazy. It's very irrational to be doing what we're doing, yet we just keep doing it over and over. It's like the definition of insanity. So,
Right.
yeah, it is pretty crazy. But I think, it's been written that the first day your child goes to school is the first day they start moving worse. And I would tend to agree with that. And a lot of that has to do with how they sit. I'm going to go back to this because if we're talking about fixing movement dysfunction and helping people move better so they can move more and therefore think better, we have to go way, way, way back to the root cause of this. So how you sit is critically important in school, because you're going to be sitting more than you're doing anything else for 12 years, right? So, yet we don't teach children how to sit anymore. But the whole history of sitting is fascinating. I mean, the desktops used to be sloped. It's about 22 degrees is the optimal reading and writing angle. It's impossible to have a flat top desk and write well with good posture, because you basically have to rotate the paper, and when you do that, you kind of elevate and the writing hand shoulder, and then you tilt your spine a little bit to one side. And what ends up happening, if you're trained to look for this, is when the children get old enough and they walk away from you, you'll see their writing side shoulder elevated, and also their spine on an axis rotated towards the direction of the writing hand. I know because it happened to my own son when I was taught this by a physical therapy mentor and some other things that I was exposed to. I came home and looked at my son in fifth grade, and that's exactly what he was doing. So it even happened to me before I learned what I know now. It's tragic, and yet posture and seating used to be a big deal in schools, but because of the money, we went to the mass-produced flat-top desk, long desk, multiple kids sitting at it, and we saved money, but at what expense? Because we're literally ruining the spinal alignment of children.
I,
And as movement teachers, both of us, it's very difficult to move when your spine and your body's completely out of balance.
I'm remembering that the first house that I lived in had a crawl space where the previous owners of the house had left behind some antique writing desks, or I don't know what era they were from, but it was not the kind of desks that I was brought up to use in school. And we would get those out and kind of play school before going into the real thing. And I wonder if maybe that's where some of my dysfunction started. And that whole idea of building dysfunction on top of a bad foundation, that comes up a lot in fitness in general. And I was recently talking with Chip Conrad of Body Tribe, who belabored the point that there's no point in just chasing after exhaustion if your form is terrible, and if it's, if you're doing a burpee or a push-up with a caved in back. And so he talks about, unstupiding the burpee or unstupiding the push-up. But I want to focus on an area of your particular expertise. And when we talk about historical kinesiology, it goes certainly deeper than sports, and even deeper than just exercise. That you write in one place on your website, the Lean Berets. That's theleanberets.com for people who don't know Ron's work. You write The true value of real PE is the development of a whole citizen through movement. Classical PE valued and supported the arts. Real PE is a cross discipline approach beyond physique that involves music, art, history, psychology, physics, math, English, and communications, and so much more. PE is supposed to be the above. Physical education was never designed to be a sport based program only for the athletically gifted or sport inclined students. And I hear echoes of George Hebert, the founder of the natural method, talking about how sports became the focus at the expense of a general, well rounded education. But I'm interested in how it plays into music, art, history. Why is movement more foundational than any of these other things?
Well, it's through movement that we develop the brain, and if you go back into the history books, they talk about certain types of movement that's better for cognitive development than other types, and also the importance of hand skills. So, a major part of my keynote presentations now, when I present to different groups, is I break out and I talk about hands and the neurology connection between our fingertips and our brains. And that's critically important to develop our brains properly. So, no amount of poking at an iPad is going to do that. I'm talking about manual hand skills, knitting, sewing, clay, woodworking, metal shop, younger children working with Play-Doh and blocks and Legos, not pre-constructed designs of Legos. We don't need any more of that. What we need is a pile of Legos, and you have to be creative in figuring out how to build whatever it is you're going to build. And then when you get bored with that, you tear it all apart and you do it again. Because we have Legos now for $150, and you put them together one time, they tell you exactly what to do in one step, and then it sits on a shelf and collects dust, and there's no more benefit at that point. And so, you know, it's critically important to do these things in physical education. Now we get into what Chip Conrad was talking about, which is the skill of movement. And Chip is one of those few people out there that really understand this at a holistic level and a historic level as well. So I absolutely agreed with what you were saying that he told you on the previous show. It really doesn't matter to me how hard people are going if they're moving so poorly, because ultimately it's going to end up in pain and injury predominantly for a lot of people. It might take a while, but they'll get there. And if you're seeing deformity in second and third grade like I am, which is nothing new, this has been going on for a long time. That's exactly where it's going to go. I've also worked in the corporate end with people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I've seen where it goes with chronic pain and joint replacements. And I mean, how much more of this do we need to do? Shall I continue? I mean, how many more millions of people do you want to trash? It's a rational question. But if we're taking physical education in May of 2020 to the proverbial firing squad, which it looks like that's where it's going to go because of budget cuts, I can predict we're going to have more dysfunction, more pain, more injury, more addiction to pharmaceutical pain medications. How much more of that can we afford? And now we get back into JFK's message. JFK was really rooted in history. He actually would cite ancient Greece quite a bit, and that's why his statements on physical education were very, very powerful. And when he tied into La Sierra, it really meant something because he saw the bigger picture. He saw how this was going to develop citizenship in general. It wasn't just about winning the President's Fitness Council test competition, or it wasn't exclusively about military, because sometimes people criticized his advocating physical education for purposes of military combat. It was much more deeper than that.
So, as a brief kind of plug for the film, what was the connection, first of all, between Kennedy and La Sierra High School, and then what emerged there that was so special, that was so unique?
Well, La Sierra was unique. It's in Carmichael, California. It was. The school's still there, but they shut it down due to boundary, maneuvering. In '83, I think, was the final year they had students there. But it was surrounded at the time by 3 military bases, so it had a lot of military kids feeding into it. And We're pretty sure that Kennedy actually sat down with Leprati on a visit to one of the military bases. We don't have it in writing, but with a lot of research and different people we talked to, it appeared that something like that happened. And after that, Kennedy went public advocating what he learned. And so La Sierra was a bright spot on the timeline of history. Most of the great PE programs had vanished by the 60s in terms of the really good stuff. And so La Sierra was that bright spot. It was related to the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a big concern historically that, we might be going to war again. So, I mean, just to be realistic, I mean, if you're going into battle, you better have people that are fit. So part of it was that, but it wasn't just the military connection. But that's the context of it. It was a military type area. The boys at that time, just the boys were doing that in the early 60s. It was pre-Title IX. They were highly motivated intrinsically. So to define that internally, it wasn't just the colored shorts. The value of the colored shorts was nil. They had different color shorts that they wore depending on what fitness level you could test into. It's very much like martial arts. You don't walk into the dojo the first day and you get a black belt. You have to work your way up to that with a series of different belts and tests and exams and practice sessions. So it was basically like a martial arts system, but in PE. And that system was created in the 20s. It wasn't created by Leprati. It was created by his mentor, Frank Griffin. So it was nothing new, but they've been using it in PE since the 20s. And so the boys were highly motivated to graduate intrinsically. They would train in the summer just for PE. They weren't forced to do PE. They actually liked to do PE, and it was hard. It was a very vigorous and formalized approach to physical education. Leprati was very hardcore when it came to PE. And but they were motivated and they loved it. And we talked to over 200 alumni, or Doug did, in the film interviews, and they all basically said the same thing: is that they learned what they needed to learn about how to be successful in life in high school PE at La Sierra. And some of these people went on to be pretty high level, managers, business owners, physicians, or whatever. And it's a pretty powerful statement. Like, what they really need to learn, they learned in PE. You'd be hard pressed to find that today. Although there's still a few programs out there that have that kind of quality. They're way out in the fringe because PE, unfortunately, has become quite a joke. I would even say, as a credentialed physical education teacher, I would say a lot of PE programs today, they aren't even worth the money. They aren't worth doing, because if you're not teaching real physical education, why are the taxpayers paying for all that? Any moron can go out there and tell kids to do, 40 burpees without instruction. Any moron can tell people go run a mile, and then sit down and text on your phone. You don't need a person with a degree to do that. And if that's all you're doing, you don't need to be there. It's a waste of money.
The film is called The Motivation Factor, and at one point it notes that the words movement, motivation, and emotion all share a word root. Uh, when you try to follow this model of La Sierra High and actually motivate kids to find some intrinsic reason to do this, do you get pushback from the schools? Have you been persecuted in your quest for imbuing a greater sense of meaning into PE programs?
Yes to all the above. I tell you, if you're out on the front lines of PE, you better have your flak jacket on. and be using all your martial skills, because it's brutal combat. I mean, it's many times it's not fun. Let's just say that it's important work, but understand that we've got a whole country that doesn't understand the connection to the physical. The physical is like getting a pharmaceutical drug, and or just exercising ad nauseum without the skill. Just do it is a nice slogan, but it's complete bullcrap. When it comes to learning how to move well in ways that aren't going to hurt you long term, it goes way beyond that. And from a neuroscience perspective, the brain craves the mastery. There's a different feeling when you master something, even at a low level of mastery with a real fundamental physical movement. or learning how to play a musical instrument, just getting that first little sequence down or hitting that just the right note at the right time. It feels good. And, we've taken so much mastery out of education and definitely taken it out of PE. So it's just become, let's just do this and let's just do that. And especially with remote PE during the COVID crisis, like I've noticed looking around the country that most of the remote PE is such low level. There's no real teaching going on. It's just a lot of directing people to do this and that. But I keep asking, where's the teaching? Where are the methods? You're saying, okay, we're going to do a plyometric split jump, right, for 60 seconds, and the kids don't even know how to do a box lunge in a static position. Why in the world are we doing a plyometric jump when you can't even do a regular static lunge in a box position or a slow walking lunge? And yet we just go from 1 to 10 with no instruction. And so often in American culture, we want to go to 10, we don't even know 1. And
Uh,
I found over the years, like there's a lot of benefit to knowing 1. And typically you kind of learn 1 and then you go to 2 or 3 or 4, and then you realize, hey, there's a bunch of other stuff at 1 I didn't see the first, 50 times through, and you go back to 1. And then you uncover more layers. That's the beginner's mind. The best teachers I've ever been taught by call themselves beginners because there's so much to learn. So yeah, my CV is 7 or 8 pages long, but in reality, I'm just starting to learn what I really need to learn. It took me to the age of 50 just to learn the basics of what I needed to start learning. And that, ancient Greece was that way. It took you to the age of 50 to be able to really govern and lead. It took that long to prepare.
and I think of the quote from Erwan Lacour, who's brought the natural method into the 21st century with the MoveNat system, and he talks about becoming a teacher but remaining a student. And I've tried to keep that in mind, and I hope that it won't take me 50 years just to learn what I need to know in order to learn. What would be some ways to accelerate this process and kind of get to a place of physical literacy and being able to teach physical literacy for for trainers, coaches, gym owners, PE teachers alike? How can they start this own study to become better teachers and better learners?
I think I'll go back to our film because I think it's a classy piece of work that is going to stand the test of time. I routinely talk to Doug Orchard about the film and other things going on, and I just spoke to him this morning, and we were talking about the film again. And if you watch the film and you think about what we're saying, you'll grasp the concept of classical PE versus the kind of PE we see today. You'll understand that this kind of physical education creates the best learners. So it's not just about PE, it's about learning in general. You'll understand that this is good for our country and it's good for our planet, and you'll make the deeper connections. And until you start thinking about it, you don't even know what you're supposed to be paying attention to. So rather than get into all the methods and, the biomechanics and all this, like philosophically, people have to get their head around this. And I've been criticized for talking about philosophy too. It's like, well, if you're not into the philosophy of PE and movement and education, then you're never even going to get there. I mean, we're just wasting our time. So it's mandatory. You have to get into the philosophy behind what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so, and if we go back to Hebert and the natural method in France, his saying, and it's often used, and MoveNat uses it, and so it's also used in my PE classes, is our credo, which is a guiding philosophy by definition. Be strong to be useful. Why are you strong? To do a bodybuilding competition? Really? Why are you strong? Oh, I want to go to the mace competition and I want to do more endurance than everybody else. Really? Well, why? What's the real purpose of strength? Hebert knew that. He was talking about being useful to other people in community service, serving your country, helping your family. It's the deeper philosophy behind what we're doing in the first place. It's
This
not
is
just about the superficial.
this is something that Michael Campy has pressed into my mind. And if I were to go back several months. I think I was already starting to ask these questions on my own, but Michael pushed me several layers deeper, where each time I would give him my reason why, he would say, but why, and so on and so on. And this is what we're really trying to provoke with this whole thought experiment of the Culture Club is what's your why? And we offer a worksheet, a little workbook with 6 questions to help people hone in on their personal why. But as far as a universal why, this idea of citizenship and becoming better citizens seems to be a pretty good starting place, and it's definitely one of the reasons behind why I am doing the 50-mile march. And you write about another group. We've talked a little bit about France. We've talked about the U.S., but who were the Sokols? So the Sokols, am I saying that right?
Yes, and I was just going to mention them because if you had to have the best example of a group of people that did it the best, the last 100, 150 years, it would be the Czechoslovakian Sokols, and that's spelled Sokols. And I like them because I have a lot of pretty rare artifacts from them and things in writing, and some of it's in their native tongue, so I have no idea what they're saying, but I can look at the pictures. But a lot of it, when they brought the Sokol system over to the United States, of course, those materials were in English. And I have some of their material from 65 when they did their centennial celebration. It's absolutely stunning. Like it's almost like a yearbook of so-called history. And they used to do these things called slets, SLET. And they were basically these great, big, huge, I guess to help people understand, like a gymnastics festival. That's what it kind of looks like. But they would bring tens of thousands of people in from different villages and cities, and they would have like competitions between your town versus my town, and it was a cradle to grave physical culture. You started off in it when you were young, you competed when you were younger, and when you were older you coached or supported it. It was all volunteer, no money. It wasn't commercialized. It was all, everybody just participated and helped each other out. And I've got some photographs of up to 14, well, actually over 14,000 women on a field at one time doing mass calisthenics, moving together in cadence and rhythm. And with, they had music and all kinds of things, whether it was Indian clubs or wands or just body weight, very, very classical movement, beautiful bodies, beautiful thought, beautiful culture. They supported the arts. They supported the libraries. They A lot of Czechoslovakian people have been very prominent in United States politics in Washington D.C. They were business leaders, community leaders. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And so, if you want to study something historically, the so-calls are um, a nice group of people to look at. Now, they still have so-called halls today, but what they're teaching today isn't anything different than anybody else is teaching. And a lot of times, even the Czech people themselves have lost touch with who they were. Because I've talked to a few of them and they just look at me like I'm from another planet. They don't even have an idea um, of what happened, which is sad. And some of them will say, "Oh yeah, I remember my grandma talking about that, or her doing something like this when I was younger." But it's absolutely beautiful. It was, and interestingly, because military history is also something that I have been heavily into. If you're going to get into PE, you have to know a lot about a lot of different areas. In military history, the history of military fitness is one of them. But in World War II, the Czech so-called men had a rejection rate of less than 1%. Now today, in writing, you'll see about 70% rejection rate from a physical, mental, or both reason. Okay. But less than 1%. That's just phenomenal. So it wasn't just that they moved well, but they also thought well. It was the intelligence of movement that created the intelligence of thought. They created the higher culture citizen.
And music played a role in this. You mentioned cadence and rhythm, and that's been a recurring theme in some of these interviews, how rhythmic movement can be a source of motivation, and that idea of keeping together in time uh, is powerful, both from a military point of view, but also just kind of having the culture cohere. There's a book by that same name, Keeping Together in Time, which talks about this, and I think we we might both be fans of William McNeill, the another sort of not a historical kinesiologist, but approaching that, and a historian sort of par excellence. So he writes of all these different times throughout history when rhythmic movement, and gets a little bit speculative in terms of how maybe human tribes evolved around the fire and the drum beat, and this was the beginning of a real primitive society where we could coordinate our movements, be more effective hunters, and create a larger society than we would be able to on our own. Uh, I know that in the La Sierra program, they integrated rhythm and keeping together in time. Is that something that can be recovered, or is it just too far down the memory hole? Have we lost that knowledge forever?
No, it can be done. In fact, I'm talking to a group. I went up to speak in Northern California a couple years ago to a small Christian school. I did a presentation last year, and Cadence counted calisthenics and how to design equipment, and they were very, very motivated um, to do something more for their kids. And so fast forward a couple years, I got a video from one of the parents just last week, and lo and behold, there's like from TK, so you're talking like 4 or 5 years old, all the way up to the high school kids. They're out there on the blacktop. They're all doing calisthenics with cadence count, just like La Sierra. And the feedback was the kids love it. They're doing so well. And so I've asked the principal and board member and parents to put together a little group. They're going to do a podcast with me and talk about what happened. So this is happening right now. It can happen, but you have to have parents like up in Northern California that give a damn, and they're going to cut through all the crap and get to what's important. And physical education is, and classical education in general, is high on their priority list, and it's paying off. So it can happen. Um, but that's another thing that gets criticized, because if you don't understand movement, like we talk about, moving together in time, this goes all the way back to tribal populations, right? The cadence counting was like a drum beat. There was a rhythm to it, and it's also the quickest way to get the most amount of people fit in the least amount of time with the least amount of equipment. So this goes beyond just the military. If you just have a bunch of people and they have to get fit, you need to know how to do calisthenics. And in my opinion, you need to know how to do it according to World War II standards. I mean, the difference between a jumping jack today and a side straddle hop in 1942 is night and day, because a jumping jack is not a jumping jack. It's actually a side straddle hop. It's a hop drill. There's a difference between hopping and jumping, and it's technically a hop drill. And hop drills develop feet and Achilles tendons and calf muscles, which gives you the ability to do a more full body jump type maneuver and to land well because you have very good foot fitness. So anyway, just, I teach my children this. They know the difference between a hop and a jump. And the hop precedes the jump training. It's the order of progression. And so it's very critically important. But to the physically illiterate person, oh, well, this looks like Nazi Germany. You're doing all these calisthenics like the military. It's like, well, yeah, the military's used it, but if you want to get a lot of people fit, I mean, I have 120 kids. So if you don't have a formation and an organized system and a prescribed set of directions for fundamental exercises, good luck with that with 120 third graders. I'd like to know how that works out for you. Of course, a lot of them are just wilding about, but I'm actually attempting to teach. There's a difference. I'm teaching, okay? I want my third graders to know how to do a hip hinge and a side straddle hop in a way that's going to help their shoulder mobility and help their foot fitness and their postural alignment, because those types of things also go into the quality of walking gait. It's interesting, Charlie, when I looked at the La Sierra program and all the hopping drills as well as the other things, what I realized from the biomechanics exercise science side when I got back to World War II methods, not how people teach them today, but the kind of stuff Chip Conrad was talking about. That every single one of those quote unquote fitness exercises La Sierra did had a corrective component to it, meaning if you do it right, they will help you move better and fix some movement issues that you might have brought into the program. It's going
It's
to help you get more
restorative.
mobile. Yes, it's restorative. It's going to help you get more flexible. It's going to strengthen areas that are weak. It's going to mobilize joints that are tight. But it's really important to understand the nuance of this, and it's not stupid. It's not something that people should blow off, but that's the common reaction to, oh, I don't need to know that. I already know how to do that. It's like, really? Yeah, why don't you show me? Okay, well, that you can't even do one rep of a 1940s push-up. So why are you doing 20 of something else? It's just, it's silly.
Right, and that distinction between a hop and a jump that you just made reminds me of my ongoing studenthood, because I don't know that I could tell you the difference between those. So it's an example of physical illiteracy, despite my relatively proficient background, or despite the fact that I've dedicated myself to this. There's still progressions and things that I'm learning. Or a 1940s push-up. I don't know what that would look like either.
I got video up of that, so I can send it to you. I'll tell you a funny hop story. When I got into the La Sierra archives that Coach Laprati's daughter gave me, she saw that I had written something on her father, and she wanted me to have all his or most of his archive collection, because she just felt like I was a person to do something with it, and her dad would have wanted that. So I'm going through all this historic video film, actually, and they're doing a crazy amount of hopping. What is up with this hopping? I've never seen so many people hop in my life. It's like, this is, at first I thought it was kind of silly, maybe even stupid. And what I realized is it came from TK Curitin, and Curitin was a exercise science rock star in the World War II generation. He was one of the founding members of American College of Sports Medicine. He was world famous, but did a lot of exercise science testing. I mean, we're talking like intense stuff, blood gases and all kinds of things. I mean, I have one of his research books. It's like, it's just completely over my head, right? Very exotic stuff. But he was very, very big on hopping to develop that movement from the ground up. And so those hop moves were put into La Sierra's programming to build a really strong foundation in the boys so they could run well, march well, walk well, and land well when they did do different types of jump maneuvers. And so they were in there for a reason. Um, and so I learned about hopping through just seeing something that I didn't understand. And I started digging around and realized it came from Curitin. And Curitin, most people don't even know who he is. Um, but he's definitely got to look at. And he was an advocate of physical activity all his whole life and competed in swimming into his 70s. And he was, I like these guys and the women from these past eras, because they were very at times forceful for their message. They didn't have any problem telling it like it needed to be told. Where today, we're so worried about political correctness, we get lost somewhere in the weeds, but not the case in those days.
It's another symptom of the soft American, and I think we need more voices like that. Whether it's marching to the Capitol, 50 miles from someplace to deliver that message, or just doing it in your local context and trying to get out and be active with your own tribe. When you were talking about the hopping and how that provided a foundation of strength for other kinds of movements, maybe think of the challenge. One of the challenges that was required in order to get the navy blue shorts, the highest level in that shorts coding system, and you would have to march 5 miles with another student on your back, I believe.
Within 10 pounds, yeah. So if I weigh about 170, so I'd have to have somebody, at least 160 on my back.
And then the push press, or the what's the plank push up, where you start
The
off in
press
a,
up.
yeah, that is another one of those movements where we'll include a video in the show notes because it's a challenge. I had to get down and try it myself, and I could do about one and a half with poor form. So
Yeah, the
uh,
extension press up. So that that's in Curitan's book from the 60s. He wrote a book in the 60s basically to guys like us, like we're dads at home, right? And you should the stuff in there that he just expected American men to do is mind blowing. I mean, our elite athletes today would struggle with some of it, and some of it I can still do. But like the extension press ups, that was like standard operating procedure for a lot of people, and those are, I first saw those with Jack LaLanne, doing the fingertip push ups, but they're actually called extension press ups. That's the technical name, and it wasn't just a Jack LaLanne thing, because it was part of PE programs and definitely part of La Sierra. Because these boys, they were so fit. A regular push-up, in fact, some of the archive films said that they were doing so many regular push-ups that they had to go inverted because the regular push-up just wasn't challenging enough, and it was taking too long to count them. They were doing so many, so they inverted them and put them head down, feet up in the air, and somebody would kind of hold your ankles a little bit, and you would just do push-ups vertically. So the boys were very, very fit. And something from an exercise science standpoint, when we interviewed all these different people, we never found an injury. So that's when a huge flag flew with me. Like, okay, we're really missing something here. Because if you watch about, just look at the difficulty of what they were doing. And these boys were pulling this off without injury. Now we have PE injuries today out of control, even from walking. And it sounds crazy, but if you don't teach a child how to move well, yeah, they can get hurt just walking across the PE field, right? They don't have the physical literacy to guide themselves through life without injury. And so we went from La Sierra, where they're doing these incredible things off the ground with gravity and not getting hurt, to children today that are stumbling from one place to the next, completely out of touch with their feet and their bodies and deformed. And unless you're someone like us that's trained to look at movement and natural movement, most people don't even notice. They don't know what they're supposed to be looking for. And that's why watching the film, the motivation factor, it's the first step, um, because from there you'll be able to connect to what you need to start looking at and looking for, whether it's reading literature, certain things throughout history, or just analyzing how people walk at the airport or the mall. It's a great way to learn. Just watch people move around. Are they gliding? Or are they gimping? You'll learn a lot.
it's one of these counterintuitive truths that the more we try to eliminate risk from our lives, as the public schools have done, the more we end up with injuries from lack of use, and then we get weak. Whereas if we're taking some calculated risks and moving regularly, sometimes even in ways that might look dangerous, we end up getting injured less often. I thought it was interesting a little bit earlier when you were talking about the school in California that I'm guessing was a private school that embraced this model. Are there any bright silver linings in the public school system that would indicate that we might see a revival of this? And how can people work towards that, either at the state level or in their own school districts?
Well, there's a few hot spots. I mean, Prescott in Modesto, California, near Sacramento, started doing the La Sierra, or their version of La Sierra, in the 1960s, and they never stopped. They're still doing it, and a phenomenal story. It's in our film, and these are modern kids, and it's a story worth being told. I've got a friend in Indiana, Tim Jordan, and he got on top of this a few years ago, and I actually went back to Indiana and helped him kind of set some things up, and he's done really well with it. It's a struggle though, because culturally, um, the kids aren't inculcated to value the physical culture. It's just culturally, it's kind of off our radar screen, or we're just going to ad nauseum exercise and try to kill it, and just in my opinion, just do stupid stuff. And so we need something rational and in between. It's like we don't want to be sitting around, and we don't need to be going crazy when you don't have the skills to handle it, like Chip was talking about in his podcast. That's dangerous with a lot of kids, you know. So we need to be teaching and enjoying the movement and enjoying our lives through movement. The the development through movement, that goes back to ancient Greece. It's not just of the movement, it's through the movement is how you develop your brain and how you develop culture. And it's just not going to work. Like, especially right now, as we sit here on, it's May 27th, 2020. They're talking about cutting PE and the arts out of education, major budget cuts because of COVID-19. And we're running up the flag of, you know, remote learning PE. And I understand, like, it's better than no PE, but rationally think about this a moment. You've got a sedentary culture, and now we're going to be even more sedentary by sitting even more with school and work, because a lot of people are not going to go back to work. The companies are deciding, hey, this kind of works great. It's going to work great until you start paying for all the back and shoulder pain and joint replacements. I'm telling you, it's a recipe for disaster. You have to have movement on your radar screen along with remote working and remote learning, because it's not going to go well. Not to mention the social emotional issues of just being away from people in real time. That's a separate conversation. But just from a movement standpoint, you know, I see these kids, they already have all the kinds of movement issues, and now they're going to be, I would argue, in even worse ergonomic positions, because right away what I saw with teachers is they were complaining about their necks and their backs because they're on the sofa sitting sideways on a little tiny laptop with their head pointed down. I mean, the teachers don't know anything about ergonomics either. So I actually reached out to some of the teachers and staff and was helping them with some ergonomic, you know, joint mobility things that, you know, everyone should be learning, but virtually no one is. And this goes back in history. I mean, one of the greatest studies in school ergonomics came out of the 40s with Dwight Harmon in Texas. 160,000 kids over 9 years, 14 state agencies. They studied the type of paint used in the walls and the light refraction and where the windows were placed and what kind of lighting and how the light reflected off the chalkboard and the seat positions and the angles on the top of the desk and all these things related to a child's health ergonomically and also related to sickness and disease. And it was a robust study. There's a wealth of knowledge in that study. I've read the whole thing cover to cover, probably one of the most intense things that I ever read in my life on the science side. And yet we're not using any of it. So, you know, how can you advance culture? This is the the culture club here. How can you advance culture if you're not moving intelligently? Because if you're not moving intelligently, you're not going to be thinking intelligently. It's impossible. It's never going to happen. It's
And
not going to
you
happen now either.
and that kind of recapitulates the value of a historical kinesiologist is in keeping alive the memory of what we used to know for long enough that hopefully we can put it back into practice. And it is funny how with remote school and remote working, we've eliminated the last sort of requirement to move, and now you truly life doesn't demand any movement from you, but it also gives an opportunity to be more intentional with how you take control of it. I could almost see the schoolyards becoming the one place that kids do get together during the day for their daily PE program, and then they go back to whatever other kinds of schooling they do from the home, or who knows. It's an interesting time that we're living in. And you basically kind of summarized your thoughts there on culture and values and the why behind physical fitness. But I do want to give you a chance in just the last couple minutes here to summarize anything that you've talked about that you'd like to reiterate, or just anything else that we left out here.
Yeah, I think definitely go to motivationmovie.com. You can watch the trailer. You can rent the movie for a few bucks or buy it if you want. The Motivation Factor is the name of the film. and it's really a first step. You'll get a you get a good foundation of what classical PE was going back to ancient Greece, what it should be now, and why we should still be doing it, even in 2020. And then I would suggest watching the Disney movie Wall-E, because if you take the motivation factor and then watch Wall-E, it's supposed to be kind of a comedy, but I think the Disney people that or whoever wrote that film was reading some of the same books that I'm reading, because it's not a funny film. It's frightening. And that's where we're headed. We're headed towards a culture of people that rolls around in electric motorized scooters, and we just recline all the time and we don't do hardly anything. You know, the cars are moving towards auto drive. We're now moving towards remote education, remote working from home. We've already got chairs out there for gamers that recline because they're designed for people to sit in for 12 plus hours a day, right? I've seen that in corporate settings, reclining chairs where people are just, it's very much like the Wall-E movie. It's really interesting if you compare those two, and then hopefully you'll take some action, and just keep it simple. You don't have to know everything that I know to become physically active. I mean, I have a video out there of how to walk well with the classical methods. You can watch that in 16 minutes and start improving your walking. You know, as you pointed out, Charlie, there's other people that do gliding, gating, and classically based movement on walking. And MoveNat is a system to look at that teaches natural movements and quality of movement. And if you want to move hard and vigorously, hey, there's a lot of MoveNat people out there that can support that. But you know, it's classically based in the sense that you're going to learn the fundamentals and gradually build on a solid foundation. You can't build a home on a faulty foundation and expect it to stay up in a storm. It's a great analogy, but it holds true with the body as well. And that's what I'm seeing with kids and adults, and even the pro and Olympic athletes I've worked with. I mean, I do some work with pro baseball, and you know, the injuries going into pro sports today is so much higher than it was 10 or 20 years ago because of sports specialization and lack of good quality physical education. So, you know, it becomes about money as well, and longevity as a pro athlete in your career. If you don't have a good movement vocabulary beyond just one particular sport and those patterns, you're not a good overall mover. And that ultimately results in a lot of dysfunctions and imbalances. So if you want to be a better athlete, great. Classical PE and that approach can definitely help you. If you want to be a better person and just be able to walk in and out of the office every day and go recreate with your family in the weekends, that classical PE model can help you. And then the last thing is just about leisure, because that's really the focus of my work now. This is also part of classical PE, because if you're going to study classical PE, you have to get into outdoor recreation. And when you get into outdoor recreation, you start learning about leisure. And the most concerning factor with a civilization staying strong or vanishing is how they spend their leisure time. If you're not spending your leisure time wisely in a way to elevate culture, then you're putting your population at risk. And how would that look? Well, you should be reading, and you should be doing some types of hobbies that involve hand skills. That's the bumper sticker version. And so now we go back to the hand developing the brain. If you're just watching social media stuff all the time or just passively being a spectator, whether it's endless amount of sports or just amusement, you're not elevating culture. And you can argue with history if you want, but I'm just saying, if you go back thousands of years, this is what people have talked about as being a priority. And that's my biggest concern now, is how we're spending our leisure time. And that's going to be a driving point in my presentations as I move forward is, you know, how are you spending your leisure time? If you have good physical education, you'll be able to spend your leisure time being physically active outdoors in nature, hiking, swimming, you know, doing all kinds of things that involve movement skills, using your hands and your feet. You see how all this ties back into each other? So when we walk away from classical PE, we're walking away from a lot more than physical fitness, because you're walking away from elevating culture. And you can argue with the Greeks if you want, but they did it pretty well, in my opinion, and we still have a lot to learn from them.
Don't argue with the Greeks would be generally good advice in life. And I think that that idea of, not just body awareness, but also mental acuity through movement, and classical PE really being an interdisciplinary subject that is the foundation before you even get into the other subjects, that you don't want to lop it off from uh, art, music, English, math. You want it to be something that feeds into it and gives people the energy and the focus to do it throughout the day. I know just having this conversation, I'm already feeling a little bit antsy and motivated to get out and start moving around and using my hands, using my grip. So it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I am very thankful for you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on. I hope it helps people, and I hope they move forward elevating culture, because that's the whole reason we were here today.
If you enjoyed this interview, sign up for the Culture Club email list to get strong values, 6 questions to unstupid your gym's culture, clarify your values, and surpass your goals.